Where are we now? What's happening?
I mean, I think that we are in a world historical transition, that 200 years of Western domination of the world are coming to an end.
International organizations like the United Nations or the OSCE, which were designed to prevent conflicts or to settle actual war, they do not play any important role in the solution.
Decline of one hegemon and the rise of another, or potential another, a new super great power, always leads to tensions that are extremely dangerous.
To provide a certain framework for such agreements to happen soon, because otherwise it will be a deadlock. Think that the other side will go further.
The world is not being run by principles, and that we do have the international law, and there's reasons why the West is talking about the international rules-based order, which is actually coming from Grotius, like justified Dutch piracy against Portuguese ships by saying you are violating like this universal order of how you do your colonial businesses.
Hello and welcome to IGRec Talks. My name is Angelina Davidova. I'm a fellow of the Institute for Global Reconstitution, and we're hosting a second discussion in the season of 2024-2025. The series of talks is being hosted by the Institute for Global Reconstitution, which is a factory of thoughts, analytical center and research center, set up in 2024 by groups of academics, researchers, political scientists, philosophers, but also practitioners from the area of media and environmental practice, coming originally from Russia and now being in exile in many countries, being forced to leave the country after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Within our institution, we do research mainly in the area of the new global security infrastructure, political economy, and also environmental and climate agenda with a focus on extractivism. And this talk, the second talk in this season, is connected with the area of security. We're recording it here in Berlin in mid-March 2025, just a few days after first ideas were put on table following intense negotiations between the new US administration and Ukrainian administration, with an idea of coming to a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. We'll see how the situation develops. In the meantime, today we will be talking about the new security infrastructure for Europe, for the world. We will try to think how peace is possible in 21st century. What can be done? Who should do it? How can we proceed to a new, safer world in these very difficult conditions and very difficult times when militarization is growing and there are more and more military conflicts all around the world. And with me today, we have three wonderful speakers. Two colleagues of mine from IGRec, from the Institute of Global Reconstitution, Artemy Magun and Felix Jaitner. And also with us today in Berlin is Ingar Solty. Ingar is a senior fellow for peace and security policy with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So my first question is, where are we now? Like, what is the current situation? Like, how do you see it? How would you observe the situation? Where are we now? What's happening? Ingar?
Well, if you believe some liberal commentators or the liberal commentariat, it's like that we're returning to the great man theories in history of the 19th century. There's this Trump guy coming around and he's suddenly shifting US foreign policy around. He is, as the hashtags on Twitter or like X and Facebook and everywhere else suggested, he is Putin's puppet or he's a Russian asset. And it makes you wonder how someone like who is a Russian asset could survive one day in office if he actually were a Russian asset, right? So I think that we need to dig deeper and consider like first whether it is an actual shift in US foreign policy or whether the moments of continuity aren't actually bigger than they seem to be. And then if there is a shift and to what degree, what led to this shift. And in my view, it seems that the continuity is much bigger than we think it is. Like, I don't think that we're seeing, that Trump is a decline manager, as some people are suggesting, like he's back to Kissinger politics, of great power politics, where America has the Americas as his hemisphere, and Russia gets to get Ukraine, and China possibly gets to get Taiwan, which doesn't fit with Marco Rubio or Trump's position on China in the past 10 years. So I don't buy this yet. What I think the situation is that the US have already won what they could win in what turned into a proxy war with Russia. Namely, the official goal was weakening Russia and depleting it of its military capabilities, which I think was largely successful, including Russia's losses of world market shares in a booming arms world market. And the unofficial goal, I think, was to force Europeans to increase military spending within NATO, to create a transatlantic division of labor against China. And I think that also materialized as a result of the war. I mean, the Europeans were hesitant to embrace the 2% GDP goal of NATO. Now they're overachievers in that department. So I think that happened. And everything else now would necessitate direct NATO troops. Because it's not like, as we've been told, that the next round of arms and weapons deliveries could be the game changer. Regardless of how many weapons you send, you need the soldiers that can actually use those. And now we see that the Ukrainian working class is actually ending the war by resisting, the forced recruitment by the Ukrainian state. There's no volunteers that can be sent to a war of attrition that cannot be won. And all the attempts to bring in more recruits, like more soldiers, are failing. I mean, now the Zelensky government wants to bring in 18 to 24-year-olds on a one-year contract with, tuition-free college education and with interest-free mortgages and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's going to work out. And so it seems that the war is at a dead end from the Western side, possibly not the Russian side. That'll be interesting to discuss, whether Russia might actually continue this war. But it seems that there are reasons why why Trump is doing what he's doing. And I think he's essentially, despite all the differences that do exist with Biden, he's essentially harvesting the seeds that Biden sowed.
Right. Artemy, what's your take on the current situation?
So, yeah, I second mostly what Ingar was saying, even though I do kind of think that Trump is a decline manager. Decline or simply a certain reconfiguration of American empire is going on. And I doubt that even the successors of Trump will be able to pull this back and to return to the status quo. One should remind to what Ingar already said that America lost how many 3 or 4 wars in the last several decades and has not probably won anymore. And this is a typical situation when a great power kind of declines or withdraws or starts some kind of introspective work, and that's exactly what's happening with America. But particularly in the contemporary world, because of the electoral democracy, the attention of the media is so much focused on the internal policy, because that's what matters to the electorate. And that's why we tend to think that Trump is this kind of very strange populist leader, that he's a protest candidate and now protest president, that he is somehow authoritarian. That all may well be, but the decisive role is the decisive question is the role of America in the world. Everything else follows. So this is a crisis of hegemony, a hegemonic crisis, and It's not very original to say this. I mean, there were people on the left who've been saying, like for decades, that there is decline of American power. But no one really believed this, and because also there were no overly ostensive signs, and now there are ostensive signs. And Trump, of course, is trying to play the bad cards well, in a sense. He's, as we see, he's not giving up, he's not surrendering, he's playing a very forceful geopolitical game, but all of this, in a way, is to conceal weakness. Which is, again, it will not be disastrous for the United States, not at all. I think actually Trump's ideas about like moving back to the Monroe Doctrine is quite reasonable. Like, it's a rational idea. It's a little less rational to conquer Greenland and Canada. So maybe, I don't know how he's going to do that, but that to set these goals is rational. I don't doubt, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of logic. So again, liberal commentators who are saying that Trump is mad, they are themselves mad. There is a very clear policy there. It's a little madder with tariffs. That's another issue, but it's a little contradictory. But the rest is quite logical. So that's one thing. On the other hand, the other feature of what's going on is the crisis of globalization, of the so-called globalization. But there was indeed a globalization. One element of globalization was the promise of economic prosperity.
To everyone.
Not to everyone, but to those who behave. And many of us come from Russia, and in Russia, in spite of all the authoritarianism and everything, there was a certain dominating hegemonic discourse in the universities, in the social sciences, starting with the 90s, but very resilient, saying that Russia is like a bad student in the school of capitalism, that it's not creating sufficiently convenient conditions for business, that it doesn't attract investment, and that instead it is subject to the resource curse. And as a subject of the resource curse, it is like doomed, but it should do like Norway, and that's what it eventually did, like to sterilize the money. Unfortunately, that, I mean, again, almost every single political scientist in Russia I know were saying this. And I think that all of these people should be like gathered in some square if they're still, I don't know, available, if they still have jobs, and should repent like publicly. It's a joke. No, I mean, I don't think we should like be ashamed of this in any way, because I do think that these people, they will keep occupying the key academic positions, and the same is true about the United States to a degree. It was a little less dominant, this discourse, but it was dominant in the United States too. And these people will now say the opposite, and they will keep the highest positions in the academia. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Come on, this paradigm and this discourse was totally falsified by the events, by the history. And Putin, again, not the maddest guy. I mean, a pretty rational guy in his own way. He understood that pretty early on. So maybe he exaggerated this, but already in the end of the zeros, he and his team, they were, and they originally bought this story, like through Kudrin, etc., that we just need more investment and then we will be like China.
Who was the finance minister at the time, right?
Yeah,
Just to...
very influential. He was one of the liberal advisors. But Putin himself, he actually changed his mind quite early on. But at that time, he was saying that. And so Putin understood, again, not he personally, probably a group of people, that this was, at least in part, that this was a deceptive maneuver. Or not purposefully, or maybe purposefully, but it was just wrong. Because you cannot just through kind of liberal economic policy, you cannot jump out of the semi-periphery of the global capitalism. That it requires the actual brute force, and that the development of the West, and actually the development of China too, if we consider the moment when it started and the role of the United States, the role of Kissinger, etc. There was the intuition that actually the country, at least Russia, should draw on its internal resources and should pursue aggressive imperialism like the United States does.
And this is what it did with invading Ukraine.
Not even before Ukraine. Syria was the first. They just needed to conquer something.
Oh, Georgia, right? Yeah.
Georgia, was a more difficult case. It was an actual conflict, but yeah. So they had to project force. They had to aggressively fight for markets, and to create allies. Because they understood the mercantilist, the increasingly mercantilist character of the global economy. And this was a self-fulfilling prophecy to a degree. Maybe even if globalization and financial financial universalism did work for a while, to some extent, after such moves by Putin and partly by China too, it simply stopped working.
Felix, what's your position? What's happening now? How do you see that?
Well, against the background of what Artemy and Ingar have just described, I would like to conclude that I think we observe the erosion of the international law. And this has very far-reaching consequences because it destabilizes the international order and it makes future conflicts very likely to happen. And I think the war in Ukraine is a very good example in a way how international organizations like the United Nations or the OSCE, which were designed to prevent conflicts or to settle actual war, they do not play any important role in the solution.
And why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, it is a process that we have observed. The erosion of the international law did not start entirely or exclusively with the war in Ukraine, with the Russian aggression, but we observe a process of eroding international law with the NATO interventions in Iraq, in Yugoslavia, the military campaign against Gaddafi in Libya. So I think military aggression is not only coming from Russia, as liberal media in the West is often presenting the whole conflict, or acting German minister Annalena Baerbock, who said Russia is trying to destroy the international-based order of law.
The rules-based
law. Yeah, I think this is really something we should conclude, and it makes the world a very dangerous place, because smaller countries like Ukraine cannot entirely rely on international law for their national security. So most likely we will observe a militarization that will go on after the war, even after actual warfare is coming to an end. And we should think as progressive forces about ways how to de-escalate the situation, how to provide alternatives to the logic of militarism that is very predominant in politics right now. And I think that's a task that we should think about. And if we look back at the early 90s, that there is a very, it's very hard to believe that a situation where it seemed possible to establish a sort of architecture that would be lasting, as it seemed to be possible in the early 90s, is, after 30 years, completely impossible. And I think we have to realize that this is a great failure of progressive forces in Europe and beyond, that we were not able, to secure this kind of prosperity and stability that seemed to be possible in the early 90s, and we should really think and analyze the reasons for it, why this was not possible. And this political failure is something that, at least in my opinion, is not very aware within progressive forces right now.
Mm-hmm. And Gili, may I jump in here?
Just very quickly,
sure.
Yeah.
Quickly, no, because I just think that this is a bridge to the next topic, the topic of peace.
But
maybe you want to make this bridge.
But before that, I wanted to, ask you a very quick question, and I would want a very, very brief answer from you.
And then I will just return to what Felix.
Right.
We are not forgetting what Felix
Right,
said.
exactly. We're not forgetting anything. My question is, so the current, if I hear you right, and I was actually surprised the way, especially Ingar and you, Artemy, you provided us with a very practical and realistic picture, right? Okay, this is happening, but we understand why it's happening. And in a way, it's even logical that it's happening like this, right? So my question, which would probably require yes or no answer, is the current state of affairs, when there's no one global policeman in the world, as at the times when international organizations and based on rule of law are not working properly, is it a more dangerous place to be than before? Is it less safe?
For whom?
Oh, okay, you can elaborate on that. But, you can say if it's more dangerous or less dangerous, but you can also maybe add for whom.
Well, I think that we are in a world historical transition, that 200 years of Western domination of the world are coming to an end, and that we're seeing that we cannot understand the war in Ukraine or any other geopolitical rivalry in the world without understanding the US-China rivalry as the key concept of the 21st century that will define the outcome of the world that is just emerging. And if we, and both left-wing critical social scientists as well as realist international relations theorists and analysts, they both agree that the decline of one hegemon and the rise of another, or potential another, a new super great power, always leads to tensions that are extremely dangerous, that make the world dangerous. As Giovanni Arrighi would call it, systemic chaos, or as Graham T. Allison would say, it's the Thucydides trap. But they kind of arrive from different angles at a similar conclusion. This is a very, very dangerous moment in world history.
Yeah, I second this. However, now maybe it's a little less dangerous in the military sense, not in the sense of losing your money. It's maybe more dangerous, but in the military sense, of course, the peak of danger I think was in 22, when Putin was threatening nuclear war, and everyone else was also threatening nuclear war, because this crisis burst out a little bit unexpectedly for many observers. And now there is some kind of mental reconfiguration again, mental reconstitution, that made the actors adjust a little bit. So that's a little less dangerous. There is this doctrine from the 19th century, in a way, a realist doctrine of the balance of power, right? So balance is emerging out of a disbalance. So first there is a certain chaos or disequilibrium, and then people understand what's going on, and they say, okay, well, here we kind of find a certain relative equilibrium. This crisis might have shown one, but it's so far it's the balance of military forces. The balance of military forces is more or less clear. With China, America, it's also balanced. However, it's not the only force that exists. There is also economy. And the economic distribution of power doesn't coincide with the distribution of military power. And that is something that is still dangerous and is emerging and developing, this kind of readjustment of these two layers, at least these two.
I don't think I can add a lot to what has already been said. I would say that the destabilizing effects, they are very visible in times of transition, because in a period where the order is still not very clear and it is struggled about, this leaves room for uncertainty and also for for new players to step in. And I think if we want to have a very plastic example, I think the post-Soviet space is one of the hotspots for the new neo-imperial struggle in the 21st century, because the decline of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the decline of Russia as a hegemon in the post-Soviet space has opened space for new powers to step in. And we see the United States, the European Union, China, but also Turkey trying to exercise power in the post-Soviet states. And we see a lot of countries which are like Armenia, Moldova, Georgia, which are where it's not very clear what direction they will take. And due to economic, social, but also cultural reasons, these countries are these countries have a very distinct political development, and they are not very clear. It's not very easy to, or these countries are still not part of a certain power block, so to say. And I think this makes them very prone for conflict. And we see that, for example, how the recent conflicts in Georgia are kind of tried to be used by external powers for their interests. So I think, kind of continuing what Ingar had just said, a period of transition has destabilizing effects, and in the post-Soviet space, this becomes very clear.
So building up on all of this, and also, the ideas that we live in a great reconstruction times, the times where the old balances are no longer valid and new balances are still not there. So what is your, or maybe our, if we will have a common vision for the new security architecture, for the new peace architecture within Europe, globally? Like, where can we come to? Like, what is our, first vision, right? Artemy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I want to go first because I want to make a bridge from what Felix has said. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the conditions for peace should somehow develop out of our understanding of the present. So we've covered the kind of realistic military or military economic understanding of the present. But Felix started another very important topic of legitimacy and you could say law in a broader sense. And this, I think, is also very, very important. You mentioned that there was this collapse of international law because of aggression. But I would a little bit modify this argument. I think that this was not a destruction or collapse of international law, but it was a very complex dialectical international law. Because if you look attentively at the public sphere and also, of course, the actions by the states in the last 2-3 decades, I think we see two conflicting principles of legitimacy. So any order is built not only around like weapons, but also around certain conceptual foundations of legitimacy. What is considered okay and what is not. This is the international law in the broader sense. So the more popular version of international law is the modified Yalta-Potsdam system of respect for sovereignty. It's actually 19th century system. So the iron law is that if a state has sovereign borders, which had been recognized before, like after Second World War, or later were added the Belovezh agreements about the dissolution of USSR. These generated more international borders, and also there was an agreement on the successor states of Yugoslavia. I think it was finalized only in 2001. So this was another agreement. If we put all of them together, we have the international system of legitimacy. But as you rightly said, it didn't really work this way. It wasn't working in this form, because there was some kind of mysterious concurring principle that there is a right to revolution. Like in the 19th century, the same system, which was the system of the Vienna Congress, the Sacred Alliance, they said, we respect sovereignty and revolution is bad. Revolutions are banned. Here, starting in the 90s, we have the system where sovereignty is important, we protect sovereignty, but sometimes there are great revolutions and they are legitimate. And that, what is a revolution? It's when like hundreds of thousands of people come to the street and they peacefully and then not so peacefully protest against the government. This is kind of legitimate. And that's how we realized that Kosovo was a new legitimate polity. That's how the interventions that you mentioned, like in Libya, were justified. Even when there were no interventions, like in Russia, there were also protests, but of course no one dared to intervene. But the media predominantly said that, oh, okay, so obviously there is democratic anti-Putin momentum. Unfortunately, we cannot do anything, but Putin is not so legitimate anymore because there is this democratic momentum. So what I'm saying is that it's a dialectical system because there are two principles, not one. And this is why, like, if we go from the realistic level to the legal level, to the conceptual level, this is why this system ultimately not collapsed, but led to this kind of acute crisis that we are
eroding, right?
Eroding that we are experiencing, because there is a dilemma here. And that's where we should start to rethink the conditions of peace. But that will be my next comment.
Okay, and now let's start imagining. Let's start having visions. Let's start sharing ideas for the new system, for the new balance, for the new world, for the new security system. Ingar, what is your vision?
Well, I mean, I think that the world is not being run by principles, and that, you know, we do have the international law, and there's reasons why the West is talking about the international rules-based order, which is actually coming from Grotius and was justified, justified Dutch piracy against Portuguese ships by saying you are violating like this universal order of how you do your colonial businesses, and therefore we have the moral right to do piracy against your ships. Right, which is like the opposite of international law, which ostracizes war and says there is no right to war. We've had it. We've had World War II. We've had World War I. Don't want it again. Therefore, the only way that a war is ever just is if you're under attack, if you're defending yourselves against a war of aggression, or if your war is trying to prevent an impending war of aggression against your country, which is kind of what Putin tried to invoke with the UN Charter 51 article. Having said that, we still need to defend international law, but we need to understand that if there is no world state that can enforce it, international law or an international rules-based order is always only invoked when it fits a certain purpose, like the Libya war. I mean, you got a UN resolution 1973 for it, but it turned into it was so elastic, as The Economist praised it, that it could be turned into a regime change operation. And so I do think that we do need to return to international law, because it's the only structure that protects, as you said, the weak states from the strong states, that can prevent weaker states becoming the arena of proxy wars of the great powers. But the question is how to move towards that. And obviously one element that helped keep the international order or keep countries sticking to international law was that they considered that they all had a common benefit in sticking to the same kind of rules. And that, speaking about it in today's world, I think it presupposes an analysis of why there's an increasing number of wars and which countries actually do have an interest in international law and which countries don't. And if we look at the US-China rivalry, I mean, if, say, there were to be a Chinese invasion in Taiwan, it would be interpreted by the West through the same lens as the Ukraine war is being interpreted. There's this colonial power that is in a war of aggression attacking the small state, and they will paint over that technically, according to international law, Taiwan is a part of China because they all adhere to the One China policy. Except for 11 states and the Vatican, like micronations like Polynesia or something. But in my view, I think it is the declining empire that has an interest in militarism. It has an interest in confrontation, and it has an interest in undoing international law. But I think it's the global South that technically doesn't have an interest in it. I mean, for China, if everything stays the way it is, China is, funnily enough, is the last defender of the Washington Consensus. Right? China is, was under very harsh terms, joined the WTO in 2001, and now it's the only one defending WTO rules against the economic nationalism of the West, right? Because it's winning. And also, like, the Kuomintang that used to be, like, they wanted to overrun mainland China because they were the ones that had fled from the successful revolution in '49. They're now China's best friends because it's like a win-win situation. 120 countries in the world, for them, China is the biggest economic partner. And so they don't want us, which is like the West, to enforce them with the pistol to their head, choose sides. They don't, they want multi-alignment. And I think that's something where a new order of peace in the world can come from. Like from the global South interest in a cooperative world in which countries are allowed to be multi-aligned. Like it's the opposite of being non-aligned, or it's not the opposite, but it's a transmutation of what used to be non-aligned is now multi-aligned.
Is it more about like short-term strategic alliances?
I mean, like, take a country like India. I mean, in the West, we would say, like, oh, you're sitting on the fence, but you have this conflict with China and Ladakh. Like, why don't you come, to our side? Why don't you form a little NATO against China, as Bush tried to form it in the first and second Bush administration? And but they don't want to because it's just not in their interest. And it's, I mean, if you remember, like, the biggest forces for de-escalation and for demilitarization were the non-alignment, was a non-alignment movement. Why? Because, like, what they say, what we do now is we seek absolute security at the expense of others. But there is no absolute security because your security is the insecurity of another. And for the Global South, with its limited resources, basically it means, okay, either we try to keep pace with the West and its military spending, which means we get a domestic security problem because we spend things on weapons that could be spent on schools and healthcare and things like that. But if we look out for social security and at the expense of foreign security, and trying to keep pace with Western military spending, then we risk becoming the arena of another proxy war between, say, the United States and whoever else. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the Global South. I was at the One-Shoe Dialogue on Global Security, and I spoke to Moon, the the personal advisor from Moon, not related, the former president of South Korea. I mean, they technically are a Western ally, but they say the same thing. We don't want to choose sides. Don't force us to choose sides. We need to have cooperative relations with both the West and...
So in this picture of some decline in empires, right, like you say,
yes,
interested more in demolishing the whole international rule of law further, and countries of the Global South and some other aligning countries interested in a new system which is based on a new kind of international rule of law, but also doesn't push them for building alliances. Where do you see Europe?
Well, I think that Europe, we're in Berlin now. Germany, when Trump was first elected at the Davos Economic Forum, Angela Merkel and Xi Jinping sounded like they were reading from the same teleprompter, right? They were praising the multilateral order and cooperation and so on and so forth, because they have a common interest. Say the German export model depends on both the US domestic market just as much as it did depend, it's dead now, did depend on the Chinese domestic market. So there was an interest in open globalization. And we as leftists were critical of free trade and have been critical for good reasons. It's a tragedy, this free trade, criticism free trade is now part of the far right, or when you're critical of free trade, people ask you, are you a right-winger? But times change. There were good reasons why Europe had an interest in peaceful relations in the Eurasian continent. And it's interesting that you said that the left failed in trying to build an international security order for the Eurasian landmass. But what we see now is that social democrats in Germany have to go to Canossa, right? They have to repent, as you were saying, for ever having believed in detente policy, for ever having believed in change through trade and cooperation.
You mean in Russia?
No, in Germany, with Russia.
With Russia,
right?
Yeah.
The German social democrats, they're considered the fifth column of Beijing, of Moscow, because they once thought that Russia is our neighbor and there has to be some kind of common security architecture which acknowledges the security interests of all the countries, both Western Europe, both Russia, and the small Eastern European states with their historic experiences, oftentimes negative with Russia, at the same time. But what failed in the 2000s and in the 2010s was not detente policy. It was not changed through trade and communication and cooperation. What failed was a policy that tried to aggressively bring Ukraine into NATO, and where Europe pushed Russia, I think, out of the Eastern Partnership in 2009. Right? I think that is, because what Western liberals cannot explain, how could, maybe you can explain it to me, I'd be very curious to hear this.
I'm not a Western liberal.
No, but you're Russian. Western liberals can't explain how could Putin, who loves German literature, all his mentality was oriented towards the West, we emulate the West, we try to join NATO, he asked, the British in 2003, and then we want a Eurasian economic zone from Lisbon to Vladivostok. How could that Western-oriented, Western liberal modernizer turn into the rabidly anti-Western, anti-European authoritarian
we've
Putin
talked
of today.
a little bit about
and I
this,
think
right?
I think that Europe has, and the United States have played a role in this. Like they have a responsibility that they don't want to admit.
There were two. One were the interventions that Felix described, and another was that, as you also said, no one was really accepting Russia into these institutions. So Russia was, and because Russia is so personalistic, there was like Putin and Medvedev, several people, and basically they were invited to some structures like G8, etc. But generally they felt like they are not welcome. Like the European Union, NATO, there it was a no-no to Russia. So Russia increasingly saw Europe as a, even economically, as a tariff zone that is hostile to it. And even though Putin certainly didn't want to sever relationships with Germany until very late, but he didn't really, as you said, he didn't perceive the West as being friendly to Russia any longer. They saw a certain exclusion. And again, having lived in Russia at that time, I mean, you could see that even on the personal level. No one wanted to invite, to talk to Russian intellectuals either. Like it was on no level. It was like a little bit like non-recognition story.
Let's maybe get back to the visions of the new security structure in Europe and globally. Felix, Artem, who would like to go next?
I would like to tie in what Ingar just said about the idea of security that comes from the policy of détente, because I think that gives us a certain understanding of how to create a security structure that could be lasting and robust. Because it is very important to have a common understanding of security. So meaning a security that is not defined as security against or at the expense of a certain party or country, but as a common task, right? So understanding we can only be secure if everyone within this area of security feels secure, right? And I think this is a very important step as it guarantees stability and does not create tensions on the expense of another party, country, whatever. But it failed. I mean, to a certain extent, it was successful in the 80s, and I would say still in the 90s to a certain point. But like you have rightly said, the idea of social democrats that mutual dependence would create a certain, security against war. This idea has failed because in Germany, no one really could expect did expect the Russian aggression against Ukraine, because everyone thought Russia, the European Union and Germany are the biggest export markets for Russian oil and gas, and they will never sacrifice that. And that's why they will never attack Ukraine, because that would mean that essentially Germany and the EU will stop importing Russian oil and gas. And I think the idea that hard politics could again become so predominant, this is something that has changed. And this is a kind of a recognition that people and politicians have not, have only recently recognized, so to say. And this is a reason for this militarization also, or this, and in Germany, I think it was formulated with this Zeitenwende thesis. So kind of officially recognizing now that hard politics are kind of at the center of state policy. So I would say that apart from this idea of common mutual security, we also need a certain socio-economic development strategy that would secure countries' development perspective, because what we see in the post-Soviet space, but also in Eastern Europe, is that this was completely absent. I mean, the capitalist transformation created mass poverty, it created an oligarchic structure that are that are at least key factors for authoritarian development in these countries. And this contributed to the ongoing tensions and finally even the war and destabilization. So I would say apart from this common understanding of security, we would also need a socio-economic developmental strategy. And finally, since climate change is a new threat to security because it creates scarce resources and makes a lot of places on this planet inhabitable already in the near future, a future security architecture should at least in some point address climate change as a threat to security and stability. So we should really think about how to distribute resources equally, how to at least think about the importance of climate change in a way how it will very soon influence policies on a state level, but also on a macro level. So I think these three aspects are kind of the common pillars for a very concrete peace strategy of security.
Right. I like it how we get more and more concrete.
Even more concrete. Building on what has been said, and on these analysis of the crisis of legitimacy that I have provided. And also I want to remind of a policy paper that we published, the Institute, with our colleagues Greg Udin and Ilya Budraiskis. They started this conversation already a couple months ago. The conversation about the left perspective on the possible peace deal in Europe, peace that would involve the former Soviet Union and European Union, in the areas where they do not intersect. So they are saying that we should use the mechanisms of the OSCE and develop them, build on them, which I think is a good idea. And they do, in principle, say that such a large-scale peace agreement, new international top-level talks on security are needed. They also make a disclaimer that maybe it is needed for later, like we need to reserve this project for the time after Putin, whom they don't suggest to negotiate with, which seems to me like a strange idea. But that's the only one. Apart from this, I agree with this policy paper, but I want to go further. So if there is this new Helsinki, then doesn't have to be in Helsinki, but can be. Then what should be different from the historical Helsinki? How to make it more efficient and how to make it more acceptable to all the parties? And that's why I drew attention to this crisis of legitimacy, because we cannot only agree, as they always agree in such circumstances, that, okay, we respect the borders of each other. From now on, no more no-fly zones, no more interventions. Our borders are sacred. You, Putin, don't go into Ukraine. We promise you not to undermine your country if you have some peaceful demonstrations. Okay, but that would be too weak, because these demonstrations would still happen, and because, as many rightly say, Putin obviously still has expansive interests apart from Ukraine. So a counter argument from the liberals against the peace in Ukraine now is that Putin will go further. That's precisely why I think that such an agreement, or we as intellectuals, our mission is to provide a certain framework for such agreements to happen soon. Because otherwise it will be a deadlock. There will be an arms race, because every side will think that the other side will go further, that Ukraine will fight back. Putin thinks that there will be NATO invading, And then Europe thinks, not without reason, that Putin may go and conquer some other adjacent countries. So there should be a serious agreement. Again, an agreement is not only about balancing of interests, but based on the balancing of interests, an agreement, a contract, or a treaty, should come to certain philosophical ideas, to certain concepts that the parties would share. Because otherwise, it's simply like an ad hoc balancing act and not an actual breakthrough. So I think that the new Helsinki should include articles regarding revolutionary movements, first, and second, very importantly, regarding ethnocultural minorities, because the obvious argument for Russia in these crises is that there are ethnocultural minorities of Russian speakers who suffer. That was the pretext of invasion into Ukraine. I don't think this was the actual cause, but it was a very convenient and convincing pretext because, you know, in Yugoslavia, similar things had worked before. And as I said, it's kind of a legitimate thing to protect a language or a culture of a minority. Moreover, let's be very polite. Not everything is perfect in the conditions of Russian-speaking minorities in the European countries. So I have a thought, a constructive thought, that maybe we can apply and introduce the old Marxist theory of cultural autonomy when we talk about such minorities. There was this theory developed in Austria by the social democrats like Bauer, Adler, who had a very specific proposal to replace the ethno-national subjects of federation, to replace them by the extraterritorial autonomies. So that if you have, for example, Roma who live, some of them live in Hungary, some of them live in Romania, and they live across, like, all over the place, they would all together constitute a collective subject with their rights and, moreover, with their own representation. They thought of an assembly. They actually elect an assembly. This assembly meets. For example, this is an assembly of the Roma people. But I'm thinking of the Russian speakers. And there is a cunning element to this idea, because right now the Russian-speaking communities in the post-Soviet countries, they tend to support Putin. They have many, not all, I'm not saying, but there are strong pro-authoritarian and pro-imperial moods. Well, for a number of reasons. Class reasons, usually it's like working class or working class that like was declassed in the 90s. Another reason is that, again, they are not always treated ideally in these countries. But there is also a Russian-speaking diaspora in Berlin, or maybe a smaller one in France. Britain is not part of the European Union. Unfortunately, there is also a diaspora there, which are much more liberal. So if we use the cultural autonomy scheme as opposed to like federalization of whatever, Ukraine or Baltic countries, etc., which Putin might push for, but this is a no-go. I would never support like federalization of these countries. But in cross-European cultural autonomy, would be a way to, for the more liberal Russian-speaking diaspora to join forces with the working class groups in the countries adjacent to Russia. So that's a very specific engineering idea I had for such future peace talks.
Do you see this as two parallel structures? Like one structure still nation-based states, and another structure, this cultural, ethno-cultural autonomies. Do you see as two coexisting structures at the same time?
It's not two coexisting structures. It's all part of, let's say, European Union, but we expect that Russia, if it is part of these talks, would also make similar, which is not difficult, because Russia is a multi-ethnic state. It's a federation which is not politically functioning as a federation, but in terms of ethno-cultural rights, it's not doing too badly. If we are talking about the minorities who have their own titular republics. But there are minorities who don't have titular republics, like Roma or like Jews, for instance. Armenians and Azeri people who are very numerous in Russia, but for obvious reasons they don't have their own republic. So even though, again, Russia is not the worst case in this sense, but it has a way to go. So this could be a symmetrical, a mutual arrangement, which would at least also fit these conversations about decolonization, about the fact that we should pay more attention to the ethnocultural minorities. I think this is very topical. But this is not the end of the story, because there is the question of revolution, of this democratic movement, which is more difficult. And I also think that even though we cannot write the right of revolution into the new constitution, new peace agreement, or into the new international constitution, it would be a little too much and very dangerous. However, there could be at least attention to this question and a certain procedure that would be seen legitimate by all the sides, that would be happening in the cases of a mass movement in one of the countries, instead of the chaotic and informal interventions of all the parties that we've observed. So it's not like Putin can suppress any demonstration he wants, shoot them from the machine gun, and then would be totally legitimate. I don't think we can agree with that. However, it's also probably not possible to say that any 200,000 people who gather in Moscow have a right to change the government. So something in between, and this something in between should be, again, a deliberative organ, certain procedure of international mediation. So I'm very Habermasian here. There are these issues, we should not repress them. We should include all of them as some kind of deliberative mechanism.
Well, the three of you have outlined the very first ideas, the very first visions. My next question is, once again, it's probably very theoretical and very imaginary. How do you see the next steps in kind of closer to the ideas you expressed? What would be the next, once again, realistic steps coming out of where we are, which we spoke about at the very beginning, to where we want to be? And here, maybe I'll start with Felix first.
Well, realistically, I think we're going to the exactly opposite direction to what we have the three of us have outlined. The Russian war Keynesianism is pushing for an increased significance of the military industry, and it's also a reason for it also helps us to understand why in Russia there is not a strong opposition against the war, because the working class that is working in exactly these specific economic industries, and the managers and the capital, the entrepreneurs that own these certain industrial sectors, they profit from this certain economic strategy. And if we look at the last 30 years, these particular industrial branches and even this entire regions have been deindustrialized. So there is a strong impetus to continue this kind of industrial policy, as a lot of people profit from it. We can see that consume in Russia is increasing. People are mortgages on houses are increasing. So that doesn't exactly mean that people are supporting the war in Ukraine, but they are supporting this particular war Keynesianistic strategy. So this is most likely not going to end even after a certain form of ceasefire is achieved, because the incentive to continue this kind of war Keynesianism is so strong because it's economically very successful. I mean, the Russian economy has been increasing by 3.5% in 2023. This last year, it's most likely been increased by 4%. The official figures have not been confirmed yet, but it's and that after almost 10 years of economic recession. Mm-hmm. So this is a new kind of class support that is most likely going to emerge for the Putin regime. That is something that the Russian government is probably not very happy to give up. So I would expect that this strategy is going to continue, and its strength, or it supports this national conservative factions within the Russian elite that are pushing for military aggression and authoritarian leadership within the country. And at the same time, we have a very similar development in the European Union. We see a very strong militarization, not only after the immediate start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but even now, the first really political agreement that the new coalition in Germany that is most likely going to be the Conservative Party and the Social Democrats have agreed upon is militarization at all costs, or whatever it takes, as the future Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said. So this is something. So the Russian development and the development in the European Union is very much aligned, and is going to the direction of militarization, and makes future conflicts more likely, and a future common architecture of security very unlikely at the same time, because the idea of a common security that includes Russian security interest and the security interest of the European Union, this is not happening, at least now, right? So I think, and then we have the increasing Chinese-US rivalry that Inga has been talking about, and that is most likely going to increase over the years. So unfortunately, I have a very pessimistic view on the next years, and what I can only hope for is a mobilization against this form of military spending, because for a long time it was always the argument of the political elites that there is no money for social benefits, for increasing social benefits, so they have to be cut. And then the financial crisis happened, and it suddenly became necessary to support the banks. And then the Corona crisis happened, and it became important to mobilize money in order to fuel the economy. And now there is money for militarization. but there's never enough money for supporting the welfare state. So I guess mobilization is the important tool to support, to provide alternatives to this current political course. But that's, at least how I see it, so far the only possible mean.
It's a little like Cold War, right? I mean, during the Cold War, everyone was, the left was also saying that it is all industrial military complex, that it's them who really control their governments like puppets, and that's why they are so aggressive, etc., particularly in the West.
I'm not sure.
But ultimately, they opted for peace. So there are some kind of there is some kind of peace mood even now, which is not logical, maybe in your terms, but it exists.
Ingar?
I'd say that there is there's objective reasons for optimism, despite my agreement with everything that you've been saying, what the historical trajectory appears to be, like towards a new bloc confrontation, militarism, and so on, a new arms race. But I think there is détente policy is without an alternative, if I may say so, like with Margaret Thatcher, for geographic reasons, because you cannot cut out Russia from Europe. Right? There is not going to be security on the Eurasian landmass and in Europe without or even against Russia. So all the security interests, as you have pointed out so eloquently, of all the countries that are part of Europe need to somehow be reckoned with. So that's the first thing. So there will have to be some kind of coming to terms with Russia. Secondly, it's also without an alternative, given the pervasive crisis of global capitalism that we're in. You mentioned climate change as an issue, but there is no chance in hell that we can prevent climate catastrophe from happening if we now let our worlds go down the slippery slope towards a new bloc confrontation. Right. And so I think that is something that's a message that can be communicated in the way that you've laid it out, against militarism. And I think what I'm hoping for or rooting for is a moment of recognition and mindfulness where we ask ourselves, how in hell did we end up here? That we're talking again about a nuclear war that can be won. I mean, Reagan and Gorbachev in 1985 said a nuclear war must never be fought because it can never be won. And now we have articles in the Washington Post. We have, a language about from left to right or Green Party to right, that a nuclear bomb is something that needs to be achieved, that nuclear wars can be fought and can be won. How about tactical nukes and so on and so forth? So, what kind of world have we entered into? The liberals who are saying that they want to defend democracy and liberal values, they're undermining the very same values while doing so. Right? We're having an internal, a domestic Zeitenwende, which is eroding the liberal public sphere, where everyone who is not in favor of military spending is a Russian agent or is promoting Putin narratives or what have you. If it's the fifth column of some foreign enemy and is committing treason against the country, all this kind of illiberal, authoritarian rhetoric is coming to the fore. And it's actually, when we're having a new bloc confrontation, it will come to the fore in every country. Right? I mean, if we move towards a world of a new bloc confrontation, nationalism, racism, militarism is gonna dominate the national spectrum in any country, and it already does so. I mean, you said, the question, how do we negotiate the right to revolution with the right to national sovereignty? It's ironic that Putin was not very creative when he tried to justify the war in Ukraine, because he was basically just echoing the legitimizations that the West had for all its previous wars, right? When he was saying, okay, Ukraine is turning into like a NATO outpost with potential nuclear weapons that can reach Moscow within 5 minutes. I mean, that was echoing the weapons of mass destruction that George W. Bush wanted to find in Iraq. Right? And when he was saying, okay, I'm protecting the Russian minorities in Ukraine against genocide from the Ukrainian government, that was just echoing the Libyan case, basically, the responsibility to protect minorities from being slaughtered. And then the last thing was, okay, and it's a campaign for denazification. Well, that's like that's how you can start any war, because you will find a Hitler in any kind of country. Like you can manufacture a Hitler in any kind of country vis-a-vis your own populations, which is the mass psychological thing also for Europe, because we've been led to believe that we could fight a war against Hitler, and this time on the right side, and which, mass psychologically, Germans in particular, but Europeans cannot come to terms with. We fought against Hitler and we lost. Where's the Hollywood happy end to all of this? And that's why, many people in Europe, especially liberals, are so open towards, overcompensating militarism, like spending more on military because they feel so insecure. What I'm saying is, if we come to a moment of realization, how did we end up here? Then we can try to negate exactly that which brought us here. And that would start with, and I agree with what you have been saying, that will start with, okay, there is no right to regime change. Like, we have a policy of détente by saying there's different ways to address democratic participation. There's different ways, especially also to deal with climate change. You in China, you have your ways, we have our ways, and we acknowledge that, and there's mutual respect. We refute the notion that we will try to change your regime, which Biden did. I mean, not in the Cold War, in the old Cold War, even at the high points, no Soviet or American leader would have threatened the other country with regime change. Biden did so by saying this man can no longer be president. And this in the nuclear age. I mean, it's outrageous that we are at this point. So we have to come to that, and that's a sovereignty element of a new common security architecture, which could be with Helsinki. We have the European Council. I mean, there are structures that exist that can be used to create a common security architecture for Europe. And then we have to talk about something for the Eurasian landmass, because China has risen. China has nuclear weapons like the INF, all those treaties for disarmament and arms control, they have to be renegotiated. But you have to come to the conclusion we need to negotiate them. That's something that is in our common interest. We don't want to mutually annihilate each other, right? That's something even, you have detente policy is not with your friends. You don't need to have detente policy with your friends, but you have to have it with your enemies, with the realization that it's not in your interest, to come out of high school and to wait for each other and try to attack one another with whatever weapon you have in your pockets, and in the end, the pupils bring in hand grenades, right? That's something that is easily understandable, that is in the interest, regardless of what your ideology is, regardless of your political system is, etc. And then there is the revolution idea. But what about Gaddafi slaughtering the Libyan revolution? Or what about Syria? And don't we have to have a no-fly zone there?
Right.
I would say, and that's my final sentence, I would say is, if people in the West actually believe in their ideas of democracy versus autocracies or authoritarianism, they have to be detente policy oriented. Because that's the only way that internal contradictions can unfold. I mean, you've analyzed this for Russia, right? 80% were against the neoliberal pension reforms of 2019, right? But also roughly 75 to 80% are supporting or have supported the war because they consider or they believe the story that NATO has been encircling Russia. So if you really want to get rid of Putin, move forward to the detente policy, then also the war Keynesianism or military Keynesianism will, the integration of the working class will not be as easy, right? And the same thing could apply to any country in the world, and that's how you might be able to negotiate the right to revolution from below. Our leftists believe in revolution, social mobilization from below and the right of states to not be attacked and violated in their sovereignty by the strong states.
It's a very important point. I want to second this. And this is where I disagree with the very respected Budraskis and Yudin, that historically, particularly if we look at Russia, the detente, the kind of easing of international tension has always led to certain liberalization, and that means also more possibilities for different opposition movements, etc. While obviously, if there is an international antagonism, then any confrontation within the country is considered like a zero-sum game. It's like ABC. And that's why even if we don't like it that much, if it's a compromise, and that it is a compromise, no one likes Putin. But, I mean, many people do it inside Russia probably, but mostly we don't. But nevertheless, he exists. So maybe it's better to have first a compromise and then next step, produce something more ideal.
Yes.
Yeah. Just one example, like liberals are like people like Marco Rubio also, right? Left liberal and conservative. They are in favor of regime change in China, which is quite, that's a scenario towards World War III, which will be very unpleasant. And what they will point to is like the situation as it was with the Uyghur in Xinjiang, in the Xinjiang province. But I would argue that much of that has to do with, the erosion of international law and the orientation towards regime change. Like there has been, as Chinese scholars tell us, there has been a real problem with securitization in China after the Arab Spring, after NATO intervention in Libya. Why? I mean, the Xinjiang problem or situation with the Uyghurs. There have been human rights violations because it was shifted from the Ministry of Culture and Ethnic Minorities, that what ties in with what some things of what you've been saying, protecting minority rights and autonomy of minorities, shifted from there towards the Ministry of the Interior. So a logic of cultural integration, and where it's a mixed bag of homogeneity, as kind of, allowing people to participate in the wealth of the country, but at the same time, of course, also controlling them, was shifted into a securitized discourse of a police issue, an issue of order. So we are actually, by moving towards bloc confrontation, we're actually reinforcing what we pretend we are against. And that's, I think, is key in understanding why detente policy is so important.
That's a very interesting argument, I feel like, which you don't often hear. And but overall, I have a feeling like we have an amazing discussion, and I hear so much new, and I also hope that our viewers and our listeners will also learn a lot from this discussion. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I have one final question for all of you, and I would expect a very precise and brief answer.
You can edit afterwards. Just cut all the unnecessary stuff.
We speak a lot about the new security architecture in terms of national governments, in terms of ethno-cultural autonomies. Where is the role of civil society? Where is the role of people? I mean, you mentioned possible mobilization, right, of people as one of the factors for change. You mentioned the right for revolutions, right? You also come up with some ideas. If you were to summarize it, what's your vision for civil society? What's your vision for grassroots movements or other movements? What's the role of also us, right, in all of this?
It's a very valid question. I think we mentioned it already, that the new, at least I did, that the new architecture should include some process in the case of civic disobedience, civic protests, etc. There must be some process and some standing for minorities. and that also means civil society, because these minorities are probably organized in some way. And this shows also that the people, again, you can think of people of the masses in different ways. You can think about them as a monolithic, majority, solidarity, nation, etc. Or you can think of them, as you mentioned, as civil society, which means more fragmented. So both are important. But I think that generally speaking, these grassroots organizations may also be very dangerous. It's the democratization of politics after the Second World War that ultimately generated the current crisis. Democracy is obviously much more insecure and dangerous than like a monarchic world. It's less predictable. You don't know what to expect. There are actors here, actors there, internal conflicts, and then everyone thinks that internal conflicts are external conflicts because they overdetermine each other. And we keep hearing that, oh, these are not the true civil society actors. They are foreign agents. Putin is saying this all the time, but United States was also saying this about Trump, like at some point, that he is a Russian agent. This was more or less official discourse 10 years ago. So it's a very seductive accusation and a very troubling one. These should again be somehow codified and included into the new architecture. I don't know how exactly, but for example, I would say that, yeah, let's just accept that foreign intervention into one's political life is legitimate. Right? What's the problem? I mean, frankly speaking. Okay, well, the borders are not absolute. Yes, people participate. There should just be some kind of strict limitations. I don't know, the key media outlets, the largest audience, those that have largest audience might be restricted from the foreign ownership. But apart from that, I think that if everyone agrees, then one could accept that this is not a problem as long as it is open.
Ingar?
I would start by saying that we were led to believe that when World War I happened, that everybody was enthusiastic about it. But we now know through historical research that it was the upper middle classes that supported it enthusiastically. For the workers, it was just a tragedy, especially farm workers, because they were missing during harvest season, and peasants. So I think that while it's the upper classes that start wars and have an interest in wars, like the lower classes, the mass populations don't have an interest. They have an interest in peace, and they have an interest in peaceful relations in the world. And we saw it now in the Ukraine war. As I mentioned earlier, it is now, the war is not ending, or the war is ending because the lower classes, the working class, especially in Ukraine, is no longer doing what it's supposed to do, and that's why the upper classes can no longer continue what they would like to continue. And we saw that the biggest victims of the war have been the working classes internationally. It was like the ethnic minorities and the working class in Russia that's been shipped to war. It's been the working class in Ukraine that's been forcefully recruited to the war, increasingly so. It's been also the working classes in Europe that have paid the biggest, or borne the brunt of the war through the sanctions, counter-sanctions, inflation, and mass impoverishment. And nobody talks about the working classes and popular masses in Africa, where inflation due to agricultural produce, energy costs, etc., has gone through the roof, because those are weak states, those are poor states that have very limited resources to offset the impact that inflation had, right? And so the wars and insecurity, militarism is destabilizing the lives of the lower classes, and therefore, in the name of the lower classes, those wars must end, and we have to find common security for them.
Felix?
I think hard politics are often a matter of state policy, and by supporting or by encouraging social movements, but also civil society to become active and to, for example, the anti-war movement. This helps to make these issues more transparent, you know, and to democratize all these issues of hard politics, because the question of war and peace is not a mere issue or a mere decision of state politicians and maybe the elites, but especially in a democracy, it is the decision of the entire nation. So I think civil society has a great role to play in the issue of war and peace, as it is not only a matter of national security, but also a way to make sure that these decisions are transparent and not made on the expense of certain classes, as Ingar has just pointed out. So I think civil society plays a great role here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. I feel like the conversation we had was really very rich in new ideas, new suggestions, and new visions, and even first practical steps towards the new global and European security system and peace infrastructure. That was the second IGRec Talks. That was the second discussion we had in the season of 2024-2025. I would remind you that the IGRec Talks are being organized and recorded by the Institute for Global Reconstitution. My name is Angelina Davidova. I'm a fellow of this institution and also the moderator, one of the moderators of these talks. Thank you for being with us. Follow us on social media. Share this recording, this talk, with anyone you know who you might think would find it interesting and insightful and relevant for what they do or for what you're interested in. We're staying in touch, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.